Can you hear me? Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to do the whole panel in English. You're getting my voice translated, so that should be fine. Please, to start, I would like you all to a big applause for all these authors that came here today to see us. Yes, and let's get to the point because we're slightly late. So we are going to talk, or we're going to try to talk about science fiction, fantasy, and horror tradition in Europe, or even if we have one. I think that's going to be one of the topics of the panel. And I would like to start with you, Lisa, for a very interesting reason, because we have many nationalities here, and most of them are actually even crossed. For example, Aleksandra, you've come from Poland, but you've been living in Spain, now in Belgium, and so on and so forth. You came from Texas. I actually discovered that yesterday. I thought you were British.
I am British.
Yeah, but you're living since the 80s in Scotland, which is...
Yes.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask, like a person that comes from Texas and goes all the way to United Kingdom, and let's get straight to the cake. Did you notice when you arrived, in terms of authors and science fiction, books that were published, like a big difference with what was going on in the U.S.?
Well, not really. And the thing is, I grew up always reading a lot of British fantasy and British children's books, and I did see a difference between in the science fiction world, partial difference. There seemed to be a little more. At that time, in the 80s, I was in London, because I only came to Scotland in 1990. But it was very, a bit more experimental and a bit more, in America it seemed maybe more politicized in a way. There were the conservative writers who said, we're writing for people's beer money, so we don't want to offend the readers kind of idea. And then you had the others, the more liberal ones, or even the more radical ones, like Bruce Sterling, who was pretty radical, but who said, no, this is like a serious business. We really have to look at what the future might be and try and warn people about it, or make people think about what they're doing and how it may affect the world and affect the future. So there was a strand that I felt was sort of connected to the British New Wave, which of course by that time was already, the New Wave had become the Old Wave, or it was dying down. But there was a very, collegial attitude. I mean, everybody knew everybody. It was it was smaller, it's a smaller country, because in America everybody was scattered all over, and you had people on the West Coast, people on the East Coast, a few people down in Texas, not as many as there were later. But being close to London meant I could go to this thing called the Science Fiction Supper Club, and they would even make a toast to the Queen back in those days. It feels more like I'm talking about the Victorian era than 1980. But there was also what I found as soon as I arrived, there was a more depressed mood than in America about money. And but then apparently publishers are always talking about how they're all about to go out of business. They can't afford to buy many more new books. All the same old.
I have to ask you, actually, because I want to connect with Aleksandra. Did you end up meeting Stanisław Lem?
Did I? No.
No?
I never did. No.
Okay, well, because he was around, right?
Not in London, I don't think.
No, not in London, but in Europe.
But in Europe. Yes, we're talking in Europe. But the only place, I was in the UK. I went to the World Science Fiction Convention when it was in The Hague. Mm-hmm. But he wasn't there, I don't think.
Oh, well.
I think maybe he was supposed to be. He didn't.
Maybe not. Aleksandra, you come from Gliwice?
Yes.
I did my homework. It's a coal mining region, right? It's actually like back in the 70s when you were a little girl over there. It wasn't like the happiest of all places to grow up. Probably actually kind of related to what Lisa was saying, like this kind of sadness related to money and wealth being and so on. Then you moved to Spain. Mm-hmm. That's a radical change probably. And now you live in Belgium, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
Do you think there are similarities between this Eastern European kind of cultural way of thinking about literature, or the use of literature and science fiction, and a more Southern Western part of it? Because I guess you have both influences in your work.
Well, I would say to start with that there are, of course, similarities and there are differences, which would be a banal way to just divide it. But I also think personally, and also from my life experience and from my writing experience and from my language experience in different countries, that the stories to me exist before the language. And in the end, we are all writing the same story. That's why we are still reading the Odyssey and the Iliad. And so in a way, we are writing about the same thing, which to me is the writer's emotional experience, in a way. Sometimes we don't even know. We think we are being more rational than that. But in my experience, that is really, there's a lot going on with emotions. And in the case of fantastic elements in my books, there is a lot about being different. I always felt very different from my surroundings, which I think maybe everybody here has felt at some point. And I think writing was a way to fit in and was a way to become more standard, but in a way this fantasy word was always there. And I think that particularly about what you're asking about the Eastern countries, Eastern Europe, well, you know, the totalitarian systems are really very fertile field for fiction because you already live in a fiction, you know. I was born in a kind of fiction, in a very fictional world when, you know, something was going on and we're told on the TV that something completely else was actually going on. So there were different layers of fiction all the time. So it's an excellent school of writing. And I think you mentioned this gray area where I am from, which is absolutely true. It is different nowadays, but when I was born in '79 and in the '80s, it was really like a environment, perfect environment to set a horror movie. Very gray, very industrial, very sad. And that certainly transpired in my books also, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump to you, Emilio. You're local. Welcome. I also, in terms of tradition, because again, if we focus a bit on Eastern Europe, although there was a totalitarian government, to call it somehow, you still had some authors producing literature. But that was kind of not the case in Spain, and we come from kind of a void, you could say. We had this dictatorship period, 50 years. That's not likely to say. There's almost, is there even a horror tradition before your generation?
In the backstage, Attila told me that he is the first one in his country to do what he does. And this resonates in me somehow. When I started writing fiction 20 years ago, I remember there was a very small scene in the small press with 20, maximum 25 authors trying to, you know, raise our voice. So I somehow arrived there with my ghost novel in a common grave in the Civil War. And of course, I wasn't welcomed. I was like, how dare you being so ironic with such a tragedy that has devastated your country? Your environment is a place where there are people buried with names and family names. Look at how it was back then, right? I remember my reaction because back then I was reading the American writers, Stephen King and Lovecraft. And I remember telling them, listen, the Americans have built a story in every battle camp and nothing has happened there. And you tell me that I am being ironic because I'm writing a ghost story that doesn't really point to any direction, it's just a story. And I remember a journalist who came to me and told me, listen, the problem is that there is no tradition in this country. This country is not mature. And you're here trying to change things, to change an audience who is reluctant to changing. Be a romantic writer. And 20 years after, here I am, 10 books after. And in the 10 of them, I've introduced fear and more.
Cinema, Aleksandra is one of the first ones, right, in doing. Do you think it's also like translated in all the medias in Spain in terms of tradition? And also a follow-up question, do we have to create that tradition for future writers? Is it necessary to have, like a ground, like a tradition to build up from?
Tú sabes que
Well, as you know, beyond being an author, I'm an engineer, and now I'm teaching students in video game development, and they face a market which is inexistent here in Spain. Groundbreaking, this is called in English. When you try to start a market, you're going to face an audience who will be it hostile, surprised, or even reluctant to your product. They will think, oh, this does not belong to us. You look like a Japanese cooking paella. This is what they are going to tell you. And you're going to be told, what are you doing? It feels quite uncomfortable. They make you feel ridiculous. Like, oh, look at this boy who writes fear stories. Like, what are you doing, loser? And, you have to end up accepting that, I think fear is cross-cutting and it affects all cultures and civilizations. I always say that all religions and political systems has been built on fear, and we define ourselves on the grounds of our fear. So working with fear should be as natural as breaking with realism, right? Science fiction, any gender or genre that escapes realism is great. Of course, I then have a tradition to get inspired here in Spain, but if we keep moving forward, when I retire, I might be able to state that the panorama has changed, and this would be good.
You mentioned, Emilio, about you being the first one. You do horror short stories in Hungary. Are you the first one? And also, do you feel that isolated, that kind of the weird one that does the, monsters and creepy stuff? Is your work also received like that, or was there like kind of a hunger for it?
There was definitely a
No
hunger
pun
for
intended.
it. There was a hunger for it at the time. When my first novel came out, my publisher told me we had like a book signing event for the publication date and all that. So my publisher told me that there might be don't be surprised, there might be just 5 to 10 people because because you're just a new writer, it's not going to take off, and readers are very hostile to the idea of Hungarian fantastic and horrific fiction. So I'm like, all right, no worries. I go to the book signing, and there is a line, there is a queue, the people are queuing up. And they haven't even read the book at the time, but they wanted it because the premise of the book was such that they understood that they needed it. And so that was a very good experience. So there was a hunger, but nobody had tried to do this kind of stuff that I had done.
Do you feel any kind of, this is a very weird question, do you feel any kind of responsibility towards being one of the first horror authors in Hungary and starting to establish these tropes? Because, although European and globalization, Stephen King and so on, you're also talking about you, your country, your environment, your context, and so on and so forth. So do you feel kind of a responsibility, or you try not to think too much about it?
I don't care about this. The more people are your friend, the better it is.
Emanuele, we jump all over to you. Actually, I think it's very interesting you're sharing this panel because as a scholar, you are actually specialized in what we are talking about. Probably narrowing it down, right? But you are specialized in symbolism and in a tradition and in history as a medievalist, right? Do you actually think there is a line to track back in terms of horror themes or fantasy themes in European literature and fiction production?
Sí, en el sentido que todo.
I do think so, because all creations today, be it cinema, series, novels, are very much inspired by medieval literature, be it in a conscious or in an unconscious way. Oftentimes, authors have read classic authors, right? Harry Potter is an example, for example, of an author who was very much acquainted with this literature. But again, this literature is part, somehow, of a collective imaginary, so to speak. So even if we're not acquainted with this literature, there is something about it in us, right? It would be very interesting knowing how many people who write get inspired by these authors from the medieval period without even being aware of this. They are part of our imaginary, they are part of our reading of the world, I believe. And many of the things that are being written today already existed in the Middle Age.
Themes, I'm going to mention stuff like, I don't know, dragons, the magic item, the sword or the wand, are being modernized and translated into actual themes or objects or stuff from nowadays, and also including like passing into science fiction and so on.
Es claro que cada época
There is no doubt that each period reinterprets things, right? Be it the Renaissance, be it two centuries after, there is a reinterpretation, a reshaping, a rereading with the current perspective, and more dragons gain different meanings, right? In each period in history. What I really think to be interesting is that in the Middle Age, dragons were very tiny, and today they are becoming massive. Like, you know, in our society, the bigger the better. And I don't know, I find this to be funny, interesting. And, you know, there are our predecessors who did these tiny dragons. I'm going to go bigger, and this also applies to dragons.
We're going to switch a bit because you don't use dragons, but you use a very classic science fiction trope, which is a time loop. Your character is trapped in a kind of a Groundhog Day-ish. And I wanted to ask you, like why using this, and if you got inspired by like specific thing. And I know you use it to, you know, talk about time, which is, again, a very sci-fi thing. But also, like, why did you decide on that particularly for your story?
I feel in a way that I never really decided, because the idea came and I couldn't let it go. I tried to throw it out many times, but I mean, I think there is something fascinating about the different twists, whether it is strange animals or whatever. I mean, this idea that reality can be twisted, and it's you know, and I think, you know, some of these very simple twists, like the time loop or something, actually opens into. I mean, it kind of opens the world into an even stranger world, because basically because of that time loop, that this is the woman, she lands in this time loop, but she also ends up seeing herself as some kind of monster, because she starts to consume her world, because she, so in a way there is it's as if, you know, one of the fantastic elements drags another fantastic element into the story. So it's as if when you start, you realize, okay, there are so many weird things in the world, and then of course you get to think about all the old stories, like somebody else who sails out and comes to weird islands with you know, giants with one eye in on their forehead. I mean, our whole tradition rests on these weird things, I think. So I mean, yes, you mentioned the Odyssey and the Iliad. That would be what I would mention. So in a way, I think that these all our different traditions are interconnected, and often when we start to write, one of these elements brings the other ones into the story. So when I didn't really feel I chose to have these strange elements, but they wanted to play. So I thought, okay, come and play, because I think there is an element of the playful and the horrible in those. So the two things going together is, to me, you know, fantastic, whether one wants it or not. So yeah, so the fantastic or the science fiction elements, you don't have to go to them; they come to you. That's how I feel about them. Yeah.
Actually, you mentioned now, also Aleksandra mentioned, like all these classic, even previous to medieval times, like Odyssey and so on. Like, you don't even have to read them, right? They are so embedded in our culture. Like, we have them everywhere.
Yeah.
I don't know, the Viking tales, the Icelandic sagas. We all kind of know Beowulf. That's been, you know, falling down through so many works and so on, and even nowadays we have reinterpretations. I was curious, as a Danish, do you get asked a lot when you go around out of Denmark, like, oh, is this like, like Scandinavia thing? Do you get asked a lot about where you come from? Is it like perceived as something like kind of out of Europe, exotic in a way? Or, yeah, because it kind of happens sometimes, this Viking kind of idolization in a way. Do you get a lot of those questions? Do you feel more integrated into a whole tradition?
I don't know. I think the main thing when you come out of Europe is, or if you come into British-speaking country, even in Australia or somewhere, you always, it's always like, oh, the Vikings are coming, we're scared. but yes, you do have this feeling that there is a Nordic tradition with a lot of weird elements, but I feel that it is so interlinked with the whole, what I would say, to me, it's just such a mixed tradition with whatever was Greek. There's even some theories about, the Odyssey actually taking place, being a story that took place up in the some islands. I happen to live on one of these islands, but up north. And then actually being brought down to Greece, but I think it's a bit of a fancy theory. But this feeling that these things are actually interlinked, that we have been thrown down into this big boiling pot of the different traditions. So in a way, I don't feel particularly Nordic or maybe not even European, but I do there is an element of all these traditions being mixed in the European. It's almost like a narrative melting pot, I think. So I think they come. When somebody writes, Harry Potter, all these animals come in. I think they're. To me, it's not particularly Danish or Scandinavian, I would say.
Yeah. And actually, to be honest, I'm trying to really force this in a box to have a kind of a connection point for the panel. But it's true, nowadays with globalization, we are maybe more close to this switch when we were younger, and some others lived the analog to digital switch later. But nowadays, it's very hard to actually feel, oh, I'm just Spanish, or I'm just Polish, or whatever. It's very, very difficult. You get everything from everywhere at just one click, right? But let's just try a bit. Let's just fake it a bit for the sake of the panel. Stuart, I wanted to ask you, and I left you last because that's what connects you to Lisa in a way, that you live in Britain. Mm-hmm. Is it Britain, United Kingdom, Britain? Yeah.
Either
perfect.
one.
Just in case. No, because in Europe, you could say the tradition in Britain is longer in terms of science fiction talking than any other country, especially, I don't know, Spain or Hungary, that we got it quite later. Do you feel there's like a big difference between the science fiction that's being written in Europe and the US? Do you think there is maybe kind of a recession in science fiction in the US, kind of like a loss of hope in a way that we don't have so much maybe in Europe in a way?
First I will say it's quite bold when talking about European integration to come to the Brit after recent events. No, not at all. It's market forces, isn't it? It's kind of like sci-fi exists if people buy it, and the type of sci-fi and fantasy that exists depends on the people who buy it. I've always been fascinated by, I think the tradition of UK sci-fi is very cynical. That's what we use it for. If you think about things like Animal Farm is fantastical, 1984's fantastical. We come at these things with a very cynical edge. Like, Britain was an empire in decline at its pomp. So we have this worldview that everything is collapsing and dying and everything will be terrible. What is interesting is watching America, which was the shining city on the hill get to the same point as us, and to see them sort of fall into the same cynicism as they watch their world change and, you know, their position in the world changing. So, you know, we in Britain are sort of slightly enjoying that, to be honest, as they wander down the same dark path that we already have. But again, it's just a response. It always is a response. If something happens in the world, science fiction is usually, and fantasy is usually the best placed thing to talk about it, because it's a literature of ideas, it's a literature of ambition, it's the place where you can talk about the future in whatever terms you like, and everybody can come to that church and sort of discuss it. So I don't think it's a recession. I think it's a changing demographic.
Do you think actually tradition, especially in the UK where tradition is so established, there's so many classic authors we all know, right? Because we all read in English. Do you think tradition can be modernized, and if it can, should be modernized?
Well, I think if you modernize it, it's not tradition anymore. I think there are tent poles that certain readers expect. So what you can do with that is you can be the author who rebels against that and tries to throw it all out and change it, and maybe you invent something new, and maybe that becomes a subgenre of that genre. That's always happening. That happens in crime, that happens in sci-fi, fantasy, whatever it was. There's always people operating in those subgenres. What you have to accept, I think, if you want to work in those subgenres, is that you're probably not going to earn a ton of money out of it. Like, it's just the way the business works. Like, most people want the familiar thing. But I think if you want to be an author and you have any idea about being remembered in 100 years' time, which is vanity of the highest order, you have to go and create something completely new and probably accept that you will die penniless. That's the risk. That's the risk. If you create something new, maybe there's not an audience for it. If you stick to a tradition, you probably earn a shit ton of money, but maybe you're not remembered in 100 years because you were doing what everybody else was doing.
Well, in that sense, Attila, you're safe because you're the first one doing it in Hungary, so you will be remembered.
I'm already penniless, so like, you know.
So I wanted to ask you, Attila, about actually, because the thing is that as Europeans, we consume a lot of literature written in English, translated into our languages, Polish, Spanish, Italian, and so on. It's not the same way. It's not the same the other way around. But I wanted to ask you about the translation process and this cross-culture thing with languages. I think you have a fun story related to the translation of your work from Hungarian to English to Hungarian to Spanish, and something very interesting that I think it's what you were saying, like how everything is interconnected, but at the same time it's kind of different and it has its nuances. So yeah, I just wanted to, if you wanted to explain this, how your translation came to be.
All right, this is going to take long, so it's like I hope everyone has like cold food with them and sandwiches and all that. So now the point is that the fiction that I write is very specific to Hungary. I had never set out to like write internationally. I first wrote for the drawer, and then it got published, and I got readers in Hungary. But I just wrote stuff for Hungarian audiences, or like for myself basically, and Hungarians could read it. And at one point I found myself at a place where it's like, all right, this book is going to come out in the US, and we need to have like English versions for the stories. And so when I received the translations, I figured that they were just too long, and like it didn't really feel right. I'm a control freak when it comes to like texts, so I was like, I'm reading a lot of English stuff or a lot of American stuff, and this translation is just not cutting it as it is. So I started working on the translation, like, I just rewrote everything, and part of the process was like cutting stuff out of the stories that I felt were just too Hungarian, like, for Hungarians, they were just clear references, and they were like either funny or like, but I either cut them out or I start describing the context of why it should be funny, and then it would just take even longer, and then you would have all these bloated stories, and then you would die by the time you finished it. So I figured I would just rewrite the whole thing and cut stuff out, so it would be like more times, because I knew that I had only one chance at it. Like, it's like one book, and if it fails, it fails, and it didn't fail. Which was cool. And then it came to the time came for the Spanish translation, and the Spanish was translated from the Hungarian versions. But for the American versions, I had added stuff that would like contextualize certain stuff that you wouldn't understand if you were not Hungarian. So like, some stuff was needed for international readers to understand, certain themes or like certain locations or mindsets and so on and so forth. So what I ended up doing, I created a composite Hungarian version of like, what I added to the American version and what was in the Hungarian, and I did not cut it out from the Spanish edition. So basically the Spanish translation is the most complete translation of all my stuff, and even Hungarians cannot read what's in the Spanish edition. So it's...
This is actually, I find fascinating how everything comes to be in these nuances, like these jokes in Hungarian. Aleksandra, I wanted to ask you, because you write in Spanish, but the story, at least the one of the books I read, happens in a pretty clear Gliwice, you could say. It's
well,
very
it's a fictional
snowy.
Country.
Yeah, but it's a fictional, like snowy, dark, post-socialist kind of environment. But you write it in Spanish, but it's Polish, you could say, in a way, like in spirit. Like, does this kind of symbiosis, like kind of mental translations happen in you? Do you notice these things happening? Or do you just write and it just comes?
Bueno, es difícil decir si...
It is difficult to say if it is a translation. I don't think I am translating, but I talk about my books like being bastard. So the surface is in Spanish, and there is something related to Eastern Europe, to my experience there. So this is a translation by itself. And I would like to make a comment. I was asking myself, Emilio said that it was very difficult to introduce fantasy elements. I don't know if this is because of the weather, because in those countries where everything is gray, we often practice fantasy. I think that perhaps here you might be too happy. I always finish my in a storm. My books always end in a storm. I think that my country, for instance, science fiction, there was Jules Verne, and he was introduced during Franco's era. So here there were things that were introduced because they were not uncomfortable. I don't know how to explain, but the reality is that during Franquism we had the national Catholic regime, and religion could have an impact. But I don't really know. There was also a very clear connection between the systems, dictatorships, and the world of fantasy, of science fiction, like a way to escape. This is what happened in Poland. And something else, languages took me to fantasy elements, because I am a conference interpreter, exactly like people who are helping us. And there was a technique which was taught to us. So you have to be far from the original in order not to translate sentence by sentence, in order to have a unit of sense. And in science fiction, it is a way to be far from reality in order to understand it better, because I am transforming reality, but I can see it better at a distance with those weird things. So this is like Attila said. Well, she expressed it perfectly. And there is something that interests me. So you say countries with dictatorships. So there is a way to escape. And
I will ask you about this in a sec. like post-socialist countries, are more into technology future-wise and more Catholic nationalists, as you were saying, Emilio, into more fantastic things. Do you think, Emanuele, also like historically more religion Catholic focused countries were more focused also into this fantasy environments like hell, the devil, the dragons, the all these things that come at you, but not so much about, I don't know, flying stuff or choppers or I don't know, things like this, like robots, for example.
Sí, pues yo soy especialista.
I am a specialist of the Middle Ages, but for me, what happens later is a little bit difficult to understand. So the Middle Ages, it's 1,000 years, so this is what I know. What is interesting, when a dragon appears, it is not something weird. Today, we talk about fantasy when something weird happens. But in a story of the Middle Ages, to find a dragon, it's quite normal. The relationship to reality is different. So this is what is marvelous about the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there is a dragon or a unicorn. It's quite frequent when we open an encyclopedia of the Middle Ages. So there is the dragon close to the animals. There is no this gap between fiction and reality. So this is our modern approach that creates fantasy, what is weird, what is amazing. So there is this imaginary world. Of course, it is very important, and the church, sometimes the Grail is a very interesting example. It is an imaginary creation, but at the same time, the church reclaims the myth, but it condemns it. So all this is measured, and the church played an important part in the evolution of those myths. They Christianized all the legends, the Celtic and the Scandinavian sagas. The church makes an interpretation. So here we have the dragon. The dragon is a devil, and they Christianize those legends.
Towards all times, right? Like we see it with our own eyes. Because I was talking yesterday with Stuart, who made the amazing exhibition about the dragons that we can see out there, and he was telling me that Fafnir, when one of the heroes like drinks his blood or touches his blood, he suddenly can understand the birds. That for us makes no freaking sense. Like, what the hell? It's not like he gets superpowers or he gets, I don't know, toxic or something. He understands the birds. As a scholar from medievalists, how do you tackle these symbolisms? And like, oh yeah, they were talking about, I don't know, this or that, or maybe even a disease, or it's all these magical powers that then we also translate. And I will ask you, Lisa, about dragons later. I know you like them. Yeah, what do you do when you find that and you're like, oh yeah, makes no sense. Let's move on.
Tenemos hoy una mirada que es muy diferente.
We have a very different approach because we are interpreting this as magical. So it was not perceived as magical in the Middle Ages. The snake and the bird are in the same realm. So it is the same as drinking the blood of the dragon. So there is something logic. And there is this relationship with magic. It is not the same one that we have now.
The Harry Potter understands the snakes, right? So it's kind of a clear parallelism here, modernized and understood differently. I wanted to ask you, Solvej, about how your character understands being in a time loop, and at the same time she resists understanding she's in a time loop, because that's not possible.
No.
But it is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she struggles a lot with that, right? Like, and in terms of tradition, that should not be an issue to understand, but for your character that lives, it's from modern times, that this can't be happening, right?
No.
So how do you tackle this whole development? I know you're going to write 5 books, if I'm not wrong, of this, yeah. So are you going to, it's a long process to understand, oh yeah, I'm trapped in Groundhog Day.
Yes, and I think in a way there are relations between the naturalness of the monsters that are talking, and then the naturalness of her. You know, of course, she's stuck in a loop, and when she gets back to her husband, he says, "Oh, are you?" And then she has to explain to him every day. You know, okay, this has happened and such. But he doesn't doubt her in the same way as of course, if you've met a unicorn, you've met a unicorn, and the snake talks, and so there are some of these elements that I think it's to a certain extent it is, you know, of course it's the idea of a fiction, but it's also the idea of some of our fictions are just so acceptable. I mean, for instance, if we say, okay, we are sitting here, we are on a round thing moving about in a universe, and once we were this size, and then we got bigger and bigger, and now we are this size. It's like, yeah, come again. You know, all these myths that we're telling each other, and you know, how can we be on this round thing moving about? But I mean, so some of the things we think of is just reality. It is so weird. I mean, it is really, really weird. So, and a traditional realistic narrative is just a very, very weird thing as soon as we start talking about the conditions for it. But it's just that we keep in the same way as we, you know, they would keep forgetting about you know, where does the unicorn come from, or you know, we don't talk about all these very, very weird things. So in that respect, we are always living in those different worlds. I mean, it is weird. I mean, and we, you know, this story that we've been told as children, where some guy comes up and he has some bread, and then there's, you know, thousands of people, and they all get fed by this piece of bread, and you know, the water's turned into wine, and all these things. So I mean, we keep having this huge range of weird worlds we're living in, and then we have to reflect on it, like Tara does in the novel. You know, what has happened, and she doesn't know, and in the same way as we don't really know, we can come up with ideas about, yeah, a unicorn is just a narwhal that somebody has put some clothes on or something. I mean, or, you know, oh, it's just because they found this big narwhal tooth, and then, oh, so they made up the unicorn. But they might have made up the unicorn without even having any of these objects. So I think we just live in different worlds. And yes, in this story, but in all stories, I think. Yeah,
we definitely live in a flying rock in infinite endlessness. And that is weird.
Yeah, that is weird.
Stuart, you also write about weird worlds and people tackling those weird, with a more maybe cynic point of view, as you were saying before. But it's true that the characters that in your novels suddenly find in this situation and they have to solve it. And it's really weird. Do you agree with Solvej in terms of like, yeah, we need to constantly accept things that are real, but they sound completely nuts?
No. I disagree quite a lot. I think a lot of what Solvej talked about, the storyteller there is science, right? We understand the world around us because science tells us how it works. Like, science tells us why we're on this floating rock. It tells us where we came from. It explains how we made the mistake about that and that. A unicorn is an imaginary creature that got made up. A dragon's an imaginary creature that got made up. They have no fact. We know that to be true. what I like in my stories is that collision between realists, people who are just like, right, okay, this is the world, I understand the rules of it, and then throwing those rules away and making them scramble. The thing that you always got to do, which I find very difficult in those stories, is to make them human, to make sure every beat of those stories is about a human reaction, a true human emotion. Not so that they can just be like, right, okay, this is the world, we've got to get on with it. But that when something incredible happens, it is truly, truly incredible. Like, we could all stop right now and look at our world. I am British, talking to a Spanish crowd who can understand me. That's a miracle. I arrived here on a flying dragon. That is amazing. Like, every little bit of our lives is incredible. But it's incredible because we as a species have done something miraculous to get here. We perform 1,000 miracles every single day, and if the Wi-Fi drops out for 10 seconds, we go ballistic. That's the world we live in. That's what we can accomplish every single day. So for me to write cynical characters, or characters who react incredulously to things, the miracles I write about, the Groundhog Day loops like Solvej, the islands surrounded by poisonous fog, those things have to be truly huge and mind-breaking, which is why my books end up spinning so wildly out of control most of the time.
Let's not get into details about that, because if we specify, we're going to get into spoilers, and I think your books have a huge component of you get to the last page and you're like, holy shit. Lisa, do you also think that introducing, he said we arrived also, I flight here, so we came in a flying dragon. Fantastical elements and themes help us reflect on our daily basis and make easier allegories and metaphors about the context, because we pretend is fiction, like fictional in terms of fantastic, but it's. Do I make sense at all?
I don't know, but I can say something in response. Okay. I'm thinking, where is he going? You're going to get completely tied up.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
But this came up today when I was being interviewed by someone who asked. I was saying what I really like to write, and what most of what I write is very much set in the real world, or what we see as the material world and consider normal. And then what I like is something completely impossible, something fantastical erupts, and it changes things, and then the main character has to deal with it. Now, if this happened to a real, I don't know, everybody would respond differently, but if I was always going to be writing about, oh, I must be going crazy, it would be too boring. So usually, quite often, my characters seem to adjust to this fairly quickly, because I think, well, and then particularly if it's a very, difficult situation, rather than saying, oh, I better go see a doctor, I'm going crazy, you have to deal with it. So anyway, so that's, and then it's true, a lot of things we've been told, this is, when we were talking about how scientists, Stuart was saying science has told us this and that, and before that, of course, the church told us certain this and that, and the other thing is that people just like reading stories, and surprising stories, and things that, maybe aren't just about people going to work and then having relationships and whatever. They want all those things too, people having relationships, having emotional experiences, but also strange things, delights. It's the whole kind of the Arabian Nights and fairy tales and myths and all the things that people have been listening to or reading for forever, practically. It was something about some American, Native American folklore, which was, there was a book that came out, I think it was a new kind of translation, because the point, if I'm remembering correctly, I think I just read about it, but it was that there were all these kind of fantastical elements that used to get edited out because it was they were too ridiculous, or because they were funny. And you think, yeah, well, if you're telling somebody a story around a campfire, you're going to probably want it either to have funny moments, so everybody laughs and falls about, or really scary, so you've got them right there. So that means you've got monsters, and you've got tricksters, and, you have all this stuff. And there was also a lot of sexual jokes and sexual play And those were the things, I think, that the earlier anthropologists and folklore collectors thought, oh, no, I can't get this printed, so I'll just take it out, you know.
So we have only 5 minutes. Before we finish with the question, I just want to let you know, I'm going to do it in Spanish. Cuando acabemos la charla, si...
So, oh, by the way, there's one next presentation after, so I will ask you to rush away when the session is over.
Little kid, and I have the feeling that he likes horrific stuff that when I was a kid, I would be scared of. And he likes bats and Halloween stuff and witches and scary. And when I was a kid, that would terrify me, but not anymore. So, do you think we also adapt, and we need, like you were saying, also like bigger stories, bigger dragons, bigger stuff, something that shocks us more, even with this globalization that we see massive massacres and genocides almost daily on TV? Are we kind of insensitive to all this? Do we need to modernize this tradition in that sense? So, open question.
Well, possibly. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe I feel more British than American, because I like little things and a nice cup of tea, you know. and I remember once George Martin was visiting, and I was going to take him to see, there's this cave down the road, and he was going, a cave, huh? How big is it? I said, well, it's a little one. It's where this, you know, Saint Iona, or not Saint Iona, Saint somebody or other, I can't think who had supposedly lived there, you know, ages and ages ago. And there's a little altar and all this, and he's going, huh, I don't want to see a little cave. You know, he said, I've been to the, you know, whatever, the Grand Canyon and all these enormous caves. And on the other hand, when I took him to see Hadrian's Wall, and that, you know, that was built, that's just a little, you know, mostly it's fallen down. And that gave him the idea, apparently, for the Great Wall in Game of Thrones. So fictional has to be bigger than reality.
Anyone else?
I would say, I don't think it's necessarily the case. I think if you look at Dracula, that's still a much scarier book than most vampire books that get written today, I would say. Frankenstein's fucking terrifying. Things like Jekyll and Hyde, that's a brilliant book, but everybody's done the twist. So it's certain books. I think what has happened is that Stephen King turned up and wrote all the scary stories. So Shirley Jackson's books are still scary, the concept's still scary. I don't necessarily think it's an evolving thing. I think that there are certain ideas that are resonant and will always be resonant, that can be written beautifully and will stand the test of time. It's just about a lot of those books fall by the wayside because their attitudes and the way they're written are very hard for us to understand now or to connect with, or the world has changed so much that we can't. But the central idea is still scary. Whereas there's quite a lot of horror that comes out now, which is purely gross out horror, it's body horror, it's much more about how much damage can we inflict on a human being. And that's a different kind of fear. So, yeah, I don't think it is an escalating thing. I don't think it's about people being desensitized. I think it's about writing a really seriously very good book and how that connects to an audience.
2 minutes.
I think that we are a global civilization and we are more and more afraid. Every day we are more and more afraid. I believe our species is facing what we know that it's going to be our end. We are smashing down our environment and we keep moving towards this vacuum. We know that we are on a bullet and we go like, listen, I don't give a damn anymore. And I believe this attitude towards life as a civilization, as a species, is penetrating all areas, all domains, and is transforming everything. And of course, entertainment is going to be affected. So if your son sees Halloween as something fun, you know, let him play with it, because the future for him is going to be super dark.
Big applause for them. Y nada, de nuevo, sí.
And again, please run. I want you out of the room because there's another session going on. Thank you.